In the political landscape of the late medieval Islamic world, the movement of royal women across vast territories was not an incidental feature of diplomacy, but a central mechanism through which power was negotiated, secured, and displayed. Within the domains of the Timurid Empire, this practice acquired a particularly structured and calculated form. Royal brides were not merely participants in dynastic unions. They were instruments embedded within a broader system of imperial cohesion, territorial legitimacy, and elite integration. Historical records indicate that the Timurid ruling elite operated within a hybrid political culture shaped by Turco-Mongol traditions and Persian administrative norms. Marriage alliances reflected both of these influences. From the Mongol legacy came the emphasis on lineage, particularly the prestige associated with descent from Genghis Khan. From the Persian bureaucratic tradition came a more sedentary conception of court life, where women of noble birth occupied defined, yet often influential roles within palace structures. Surviving genealogical records suggest that Timurid rulers were highly selective in arranging marriages. Royal brides were often drawn from families that could reinforce claims of legitimacy, particularly those connected to the Chinggisid line or to powerful regional elites. In many cases, these women were sent across considerable distances, moving from one courtly environment to another with little expectation of return. Their relocation was not symbolic. It was a binding act, one that signified the incorporation of their natal family into the political orbit of the Timurid ruler. Contemporary accounts describe the logistical complexity of these transfers. Royal brides did not travel alone. They were accompanied by extensive entourages that included servants, guards, administrators, and often scholars or religious figures. These retinues functioned as both support systems and surveillance mechanisms. While they ensured the bride's comfort and maintained her cultural practices, they also preserved the interests of her natal family, creating a subtle but persistent presence within the host court. The journey itself could be prolonged and hazardous. Routes between cities such as Samarkand and Herat, or further afield into regions of Persia and beyond, exposed these processions to environmental and political risks. Chroniclers noted that the movement of a royal bride was often treated as a state event, with military escorts and carefully negotiated passage through contested territories. These precautions reflect the high value placed on the individual being transported, not as a person in the modern sense, but as a bearer of political capital. Once they arrived, royal brides entered into a highly regulated environment within the Timurid court. The structure of the royal household was both hierarchical and segmented, governed by protocols that defined access, movement, and authority. Legal codes and courtly manuals of the period reveal that women of royal status were allocated residences, staff, and financial resources, but these provisions were tied to their position within the dynastic hierarchy. The internal dynamics of the Timurid harem were complex. Contrary to later Orientalist depictions, the harem was not merely a site of leisure or confinement. It functioned as a political institution where alliances were maintained, rivalries managed, and succession indirectly influenced. Royal brides, particularly those of prestigious lineage, could exert significant influence, especially if they bore male heirs. However, this influence was contingent and often precarious. Surviving documents suggest that the status of a royal bride was closely monitored. Her behavior, religious observance, and interactions were subject to scrutiny by court officials. This oversight was not only about maintaining decorum, but also about preventing the emergence of independent power bases that could destabilize the ruling structure. In this sense, the integration of a royal bride into the Timurid court involved both elevation and constraint. Chroniclers noted that language and cultural differences could present challenges. A bride originating from a Persian-speaking region might find herself in a court where Chagatai Turkic was dominant, or vice versa. While elite culture often bridged these gaps through shared literary and religious frameworks, the adjustment was nonetheless significant. The presence of her entourage mitigated some of these difficulties, but it also reinforced her identity as an outsider within the host environment. The expectations placed upon these women were explicit and tied directly to dynastic objectives. Their primary role was to produce heirs, thereby securing the continuity of the ruling line. Medical texts and courtly records from the period indicate that considerable attention was given to fertility, health, and lineage purity. Failure to fulfill these expectations could result in a decline in status, reduced access to resources, or marginalization within the court. At the same time, royal brides were also expected to embody ideals of piety and cultural refinement. Endowments, or waqf foundations, established by royal women provide evidence of their involvement in religious and charitable activities. These acts were not purely personal expressions of devotion. They reinforced the moral legitimacy of the ruling house and extended its influence into urban and rural communities. The negotiation of identity was an ongoing process for these women. They were expected to maintain a connection to their natal lineage while fully integrating into the political and cultural framework of their new environment. This dual expectation created a tension that is visible in surviving correspondence and patronage patterns. In some cases, royal brides acted as intermediaries, facilitating communication and alliances between their birth families and their marital households. The consequences of these marriages extended beyond the immediate generation. They shaped patterns of alliance, conflict, and succession within the Timurid Empire. Historical records indicate that disputes over lineage and inheritance often reference the maternal origins of claimants, highlighting the enduring significance of these unions. In this context, the movement of a royal bride was not an isolated event, but part of a long-term strategy that influenced the trajectory of the empire. Yet, despite their importance, the personal experiences of these women remain only partially visible. The sources that document their lives were produced within a framework that prioritized political outcomes over individual perspectives. As a result, much of what is known comes from indirect evidence, financial records, architectural patronage, and the observations of court historians. What emerges from this material is a picture of constrained agency. Royal brides operated within a system that limited their autonomy, but did not entirely eliminate their capacity to act. Their influence was often exercised through informal networks, patronage, and the strategic use of their position within the household hierarchy. This form of power was neither absolute nor secure, but it was nonetheless significant within the context of Timurid governance. The broader imperial structure depended on such mechanisms. The integration of diverse regions and elites required more than military conquest. It required the continuous negotiation of relationships. Royal marriages, and the women at their center, were essential to this process. Their movement across the empire symbolized the extension of authority, while their presence within the court embodied the ongoing effort to maintain cohesion in a politically fragmented landscape. Over time, these practices contributed to a distinctive court culture that combined elements of mobility and settlement, tradition and adaptation. The experiences of royal brides, though often obscured, provide insight into the functioning of this system. They reveal how power was mediated not only through formal institutions, but also through the controlled movement and management of individuals whose lives were shaped by the demands of empire. The position of a royal bride within the Timurid court did not remain static after her arrival. Surviving administrative records suggest that her standing could shift over time, shaped by factors such as childbirth, the favor of the ruler, and the evolving political landscape. In a system where succession was rarely straightforward, the maternal lineage of potential heirs became a matter of calculated importance. Chroniclers noted that the mothers of sons, particularly those who demonstrated early signs of political viability, were afforded increased visibility and resources within the court. This elevation, however, did not translate into unchallenged authority. The Timurid court was characterized by overlapping hierarchies, where senior women, including mothers of reigning rulers or widows of former sovereigns, often retained significant influence. A newly arrived bride, even of distinguished lineage, entered into a pre-existing structure where precedents had already been established. Legal codes of the period reveal that stipends, residences, and ceremonial roles were allocated according to rank, and disputes over these allocations were not uncommon. In cities such as Herat, which emerged as a major administrative and cultural hub under Timurid rule, the royal household became an extension of the imperial court itself. Contemporary accounts describe an environment in which elite women participated indirectly in governance through patronage networks. These networks included scholars, artists, religious leaders, and administrators whose livelihoods depended on courtly support. Royal brides, once integrated, could cultivate such networks, thereby establishing a degree of influence that extended beyond the confines of their immediate surroundings. Surviving waqf documents suggest that royal women, including those who had been sent from distant regions, invested in religious and educational institutions. These endowments often funded mosques, madrasas, and charitable kitchens, embedding the donor's name within the urban fabric. While these acts were framed in terms of piety, they also served a political function. By associating themselves with respected institutions, royal brides reinforced their legitimacy and visibility within the host society. The role of communication between courts remained a persistent feature of their position. Historical records indicate that correspondence between a royal bride and her natal family was carefully managed. Letters were often transmitted through official channels, and their contents could be subject to oversight. This control reflects the dual concern of maintaining diplomatic ties while preventing the leakage of sensitive information. At the same time, such correspondence allowed the bride to maintain a degree of connection to her origins, which could be strategically important in times of political tension. The experience of displacement was not solely geographic. Cultural adaptation required negotiation on multiple levels. A bride entering the Timurid court encountered established norms of dress, language, and religious practice that might differ from those of her upbringing. While Islamic law provided a shared framework, local interpretations and customs varied. Chroniclers noted that some royal brides adopted the dominant cultural expressions of the court, while others maintained distinct elements of their original identity, particularly within the private sphere. This balance between adaptation and continuity was closely observed. The ability of a royal bride to navigate these expectations could affect her standing within the court. Excessive adherence to her natal customs might be interpreted as resistance to integration, while complete assimilation could weaken her value as a representative of her original lineage. The tension between these positions underscores the complexity of her role as both a political asset and an individual within a regulated environment. The mechanisms of control extended beyond observation and protocol. The physical layout of the royal household itself facilitated supervision. Architectural studies of Timurid palaces, particularly those in Samarkand, indicate that residential quarters for women were designed to regulate movement and access. Entry points were limited, and interactions with the outside world were mediated through designated intermediaries. This spatial arrangement was not unique to the Timurids, but was adapted to their specific administrative needs. Within this controlled environment, the daily life of a royal bride was structured by routine. Contemporary accounts describe schedules that included religious observance, household management, and participation in ceremonial events. Education also played a role, particularly in the cultivation of literary and artistic skills. The Timurid court is well known for its patronage of the arts, and royal women were often participants in this cultural milieu. Their involvement, however, was framed within the expectations of decorum and hierarchy. The presence of multiple wives and concubines introduced additional layers of complexity. Rivalries, while not always explicitly documented, can be inferred from shifts in patronage and the distribution of resources. Chroniclers noted instances where the favor of the ruler led to rapid changes in status, affecting not only the individuals directly involved, but also their associated networks. For a royal bride, maintaining her position required careful navigation of these dynamics, often through alliances within the household. The broader political context could also influence the treatment of royal brides. Periods of instability, such as succession disputes or regional rebellions, heightened the importance of loyalty and control within the court. Surviving documents suggest that in such times, the activities and communications of royal women were subject to increased scrutiny. The potential for a bride's natal family to become involved in internal conflicts was a concern that shaped policy and practice. At the same time, royal brides could serve as stabilizing figures. Their presence symbolized alliances that extended beyond immediate political tensions. In some cases, they acted as intermediaries during negotiations, leveraging their connections to facilitate dialogue between competing factions. While the extent of their direct involvement is difficult to quantify, the acknowledgement of their potential role in contemporary accounts indicates that their position was recognized as politically significant. The long-term effects of these marriages are evident in the patterns of succession that characterized the Timurid Empire. Claims to authority often invoked both paternal and maternal lineage, reflecting the intertwined nature of these alliances. Historical records indicate that disputes over succession frequently reference the status and origin of the claimant's mother, highlighting the enduring impact of these unions. Despite the structural constraints, instances of individual agency can be identified. Some royal brides appear in historical records as patrons of major architectural projects or as influential figures within intellectual circles. These activities suggest that, within the limits imposed upon them, they could shape aspects of the cultural and social environment of the court. Their contributions, while often framed in indirect terms, were nonetheless integral to the functioning of the imperial system. The movement of royal brides across the Timurid Empire thus represents more than a series of diplomatic arrangements. It reflects a deliberate strategy of governance that relied on the controlled integration of diverse elites. The treatment of these women, from their carefully managed journeys to their regulated lives within the court, reveals the mechanisms through which the empire sought to maintain cohesion and authority. Yet, the available sources also point to the fragility of this system. The reliance on personal relationships and lineage connections introduced elements of uncertainty that could not be fully controlled. The experiences of royal brides, situated at the intersection of these dynamics, illustrate both the strengths and limitations of Timurid political practice. Their lives, documented in fragments and shaped by forces beyond their control, offer a perspective on the empire that is at once structural and deeply human. Over successive generations, the cumulative effects of these marital arrangements became embedded in the institutional memory of the Timurid Empire. Patterns of alliance, once established through the movement of royal brides, developed into expectations that shaped diplomatic behavior across the region. Surviving chronicles suggest that by the 15th century, the exchange of high-status women between ruling houses was no longer an exceptional measure, but a normalized component of statecraft, one that carried both symbolic and material consequences. The persistence of this system depended on its perceived effectiveness. Historical records indicate that marriage alliances often succeeded in securing temporary stability between competing factions or neighboring polities. However, these arrangements did not eliminate conflict. Instead, they introduced additional layers of obligation and grievance. When disputes arose, the presence of familial ties could complicate decision-making, as rulers were required to balance political necessity against the expectations of kinship. In this context, the position of royal brides remained inherently precarious. Their value was tied to the continuation of alliances, yet their presence could also become a point of tension. Chroniclers noted that during periods of open conflict, women connected to rival factions were sometimes subjected to increased restrictions or reassigned within the household hierarchy. These measures were not arbitrary, but reflected concerns about loyalty, communication, and the potential for internal dissent. Legal and administrative documents from the period reveal that provisions existed for the maintenance of royal women, even in adverse circumstances. Stipends and housing allocations were often preserved, though sometimes reduced, indicating a recognition of their status despite changing political conditions. This continuity suggests that the institution of royal marriage retained its formal importance even when its practical benefits were diminished. The experience of widowhood introduced another dimension to the lives of these women. In the Timurid context, widowed royal brides did not necessarily lose their relevance. On the contrary, their position could become more complex. Surviving accounts describe instances where widows were remarried within the ruling family, a practice that served to retain their political value while reinforcing internal cohesion. This custom, rooted in earlier Turco-Mongol traditions, underscores the extent to which individual lives were subordinated to dynastic strategy. At the same time, widowhood could provide a limited form of autonomy. Without the immediate expectations associated with producing heirs, some women redirected their focus toward patronage and religious activity. Endowment records from cities such as Herat indicate that widowed royal women were among the most active sponsors of charitable institutions. These activities not only fulfilled personal and religious obligations, but also allowed them to maintain visibility and influence within the broader. The intersection of gender, power, and space remained a defining feature of their experience. Architectural evidence from Timurid sites, including those in Samarkand, suggests that the design of royal complexes continued to prioritize controlled access and internal segmentation. These physical arrangements reinforced the social boundaries that governed interaction, ensuring that the movements and activities of royal women remained within prescribed limits. Despite these constraints, the cultural contributions of royal brides and other elite women left a lasting imprint on the Timurid world. The court's reputation as a center of artistic and intellectual production was supported in part by their patronage. Manuscripts, architectural projects, and educational institutions associated with female sponsors provide tangible evidence of their involvement. While these contributions were often recorded in formulaic language, their scale and frequency indicate a sustained engagement with the cultural life of the empire. The integration of diverse cultural elements within the Timurid court can also be traced through the experiences of these women. As individuals who originated from different regions, they carried with them linguistic, artistic, and social traditions that interacted with existing practices. Over time, this process contributed to the development of a composite court culture that blended Persian, Turkic, and Mongol influences. Historical records suggest that this cultural synthesis was not centrally directed, but emerged through the accumulation of individual interactions and adaptations. The decline of Timurid political unity in the late 15th century introduced new challenges to this system. As the empire fragmented into competing successor states, the mechanisms that had once facilitated cohesion became less reliable. Marriage alliances continued to be employed, but their effectiveness was increasingly limited by the shifting balance of power. In this environment, the movement of royal brides persisted, yet the stability they were intended to secure proved more difficult to achieve. Surviving chronicles from this period reflect a heightened awareness of uncertainty. The language used to describe alliances becomes more cautious, and references to lineage disputes appear with greater frequency. In these accounts, the role of royal women remains present, but is often overshadowed by the broader narrative of political fragmentation. This shift in emphasis does not diminish their importance, but highlights the changing context in which they operated. The legacy of these practices extended beyond the Timurid domains. Successor states and neighboring empires adopted and adapted similar strategies, incorporating royal marriages into their own systems of governance. The movement of women across political boundaries continued to serve as a means of negotiation, even as the specific conditions of each polity varied. In this sense, the experiences of Timurid royal brides can be understood as part of a wider pattern within the early modern Islamic world. Modern historical analysis, drawing on a combination of textual, architectural, and material evidence, has sought to reconstruct these experiences with greater precision. Scholars have emphasized the need to move beyond simplified representations, recognizing the complexity of the roles these women played. Their lives cannot be reduced to passive symbols of alliance. Rather, they must be understood within the constraints and opportunities of their environment. At the same time, the limitations of the available sources remain significant. Much of what is known is filtered through the perspectives of male chroniclers and administrators, whose priorities shaped the recording of events. As a result, the voices of the women themselves are largely absent. The reconstruction of their experiences relies on indirect evidence, requiring careful interpretation and, at times, cautious inference. What emerges from this body of evidence is a portrait of a system that combined rigidity with adaptability. The treatment of royal brides within the Timurid Empire was governed by established norms, yet it also responded to changing political circumstances. Their movement across vast distances, their integration into structured households, and their participation in cultural and religious life all reflect the multifaceted nature of their role. The long-term effects of these practices are visible in the enduring connections between regions that were once part of the Timurid sphere. Patterns of artistic exchange, administrative practice, and elite culture bear the imprint of these interactions. While the empire itself eventually gave way to new political formations, the systems it developed, including the use of royal marriages as instruments of governance, continued to influence subsequent generations. In examining the treatment of these women, the historical record reveals a balance between utility and recognition. They were valued for the alliances they represented and the heirs they could produce, yet they were also provided with resources and opportunities that reflected their status. This duality, shaped by the demands of empire, defined their experience. The movement of royal brides across the Timurid world thus stands as a lens through which broader questions of power, identity, and governance can be understood. Their lives, situated at the intersection of personal circumstance and political necessity, illuminate the mechanisms through which empires sought to sustain themselves. Through the surviving traces of their presence, a more nuanced understanding of the Timurid system emerges. one that acknowledges both its structural ambitions and its human dimensions.